is the first World Heritage Site.
Yep.
In this area, and I was like, and I have the fortune to be coming back after going to all of these World Heritage Sites, coming back to Philadelphia and being here. I am so happy that Mary Ann reached out to me, kept reaching out to me and talking to me and inviting me here, and I am so happy to be with you all today. I'm going to welcome you all. I am Southern, and I'm going to welcome you all as if later on in the presentation you're going to hear where I'm going to tell you how I want us to see this conversation that we're going to have. And you'll get a better understanding about me and the like sort. So there's no way that I can go and then come back. I had a presentation before I left. But I'll tell you now, you don't go to Spain and see and walk on, places where you have the floor, the ground that you're walking on was built in the 5th century, or you crossing over Roman bridges and the like sort. You can't unsee that. So I had to switch and change and adapt my presentation to you that I already had prepared. I had to change that because I had to now say, okay, so where was this going to, reflect this very transformative experience that I had? And so I even changed the presentation topic. I called it, I just left an area that is known for, like Salamanca is known for two pieces, well, three actually. You can call it the university. I was at the University of Salamanca, and that's also the place where the Spanish Inquisitions happened. But for the most part, Salamanca is a place of universities and cathedrals. So, hence the title of the program here today. The Gospel of Tour Guides. Okay, right? So, tour guides basically give a gospel, and I'll explain to you what I mean by that in just a few seconds. Or how tour guides are living history books. And the subtitle is Racial Currency in the Teaching of American Democracy, right? And again, how the Gospel of Tour Guides and how tour guides are living history books in the racial currency in the teaching of American democracy. So there are sort of some keywords I want us to sort of be able to look at, function at, and go with. And one of them is alchemy, which is this magical process of transformation, creation, and combination, right? And so, in essence, when we are presenting information, there's something that magical happens because as people who are in the tourist industry and being tour guides, docents and the like sort, we are meeting people where they are. They can be in a moment of transformation, they can be the creation of an idea, or it can be a combination of where they are. And in many ways, we're having this practice, this ancient chemistry of alchemy, right? And we're also looking at helping people to develop their calculus, their understanding, their reasoning, like how they're coming about. And particularly if you're now looking at topography or iconography, something that someone is looking at and now having a relationship. So one of the things, because of the gospel of the tour guides that I was with in Salamanca, I ended up climbing the old cathedral tower rails. Now, let me tell you something. That wasn't no joke. And so what happens is, here I am going up these tower bells, and in a second I'll show you a picture of it. And I am there in that tower bell, and that tower bell rings every 15 minutes, in Salamanca, yes. And I just happened to go under the largest bell, not knowing that it was going to go off. And so, those are, when I got up to that piece, right, because the person said, oh, go and look up there, you can see all of Salamander, you can see the whole area. And I did. And it was wonderful. It was magical. It was extraordinary. And every time, it's never when I will see that old cathedral, and I will see that bell, those windows where the bells are, that I will not ever not see me not being in there and hearing those bells go off. It's now something that just can't, it's always happening. So let me show you this right quick. And I have a zillion pictures, so just 1 second. And it's a beautiful piece here. And I climbed and I climbed and I climbed and I got up there. And this is what I was able. So I'll show you. So I thought that I was almost there, and I had struck a little pose. Again, it was just a magical piece here. And again, this is the old cathedral here. And as you can, okay, it's not coming.
It's coming.
There it is.
Wow.
So here I am at the old cathedral. All right, so here's some different shots from that. And when they said that I was all over the city, this is like being a panoramic of it, so you can sort of see how this works. So when they said that you can go and really see the whole piece, but I didn't realize that I was going to go on another level. And you'll see that in just a few seconds. I just wanted to show you a panoramic, so they say you can see all the city. And then they said, hey, look, that's all you have to do. You just go up a few bit more, and you can see even more. And that's what I did. Okay. So another view, and I was just showing. So then go up. So yeah, so forth. So then that's that big bell that I was and then it goes ding, and my goodness, right? But it was a magical piece there. And when you look at that tower, when you look at the cathedral, we see it in different places, and I'll show you in a minute, because I went to a park. And right there where you see those three pieces I know I was there. That's where I took those pictures. That's where the magic happened. So I'll never not look at the old cathedral and not see myself in that bell tower, right? And so when we're now looking at that piece about alchemy, calculus, and iconography, that is what, we're talking about this gospel of, because it was a tour guide of going and having a tour guide tell me, hey, look, you can go up there and see that. They told us the story, but gave different insight, and it shaped my experience there. So the goal of this talk is to make the interconnections between storytelling, representation, history, space, and iconography. And because I'm in Philadelphia, I want to do a side joke. I can't use, y'all like that? Okay, y'all get that joke? Okay. All right, didn't go over well. Okay, so what happens is I will tell a story about being Southern, growing up in the post-civil and human rights movement under the informal curriculum of the United Orders of the Confederacy. So I'm going to be talking about Juneteenth, right? And this is a book that I recommend for you. But I'm also going to be talking about coming up and how narrative and storytelling is told through these pieces of not only iconography, but different aspects. So what I want you to do is I want us to act like the first place that I ever learned a curriculum was on my grandmother's porch. She vicariously took me places, and the people who came to my grandmother's porch took me places in my head, like that my feet hadn't gone to yet. And what happens is when you're giving someone a story and they don't really know that much about a place, you're actually giving them the trajectory, the imagery, the understanding the pathway, the gateway to get there. And I learned that on my grandmother's porch. I've learned the difference between and I've learned that difference, the nuance on a porch. And so in essence, I would like for us to, and that's why I'm sitting, right? Because I would like for us to be as if we're on like a southern porch. I grew up southern, right? And as people would come to my grandmother's porch, and she would greet them, with, welcome, 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 welcome to this space. So welcome to this space on this short journey that we're about to go on together. So again, I told you that there was going to be like this detour in Spain. This is at the Plaza, this is in Salamanca, and this is at their Plaza, Plaza Mayor. All places in Spain have Plaza Mayors or some levels of it. That's where the joining town, the greeting spot was. That's where everyone sort of went. And what I want to sort of show you is like two examples of how someone set up and shaped an experience. So the first experience that I'm going to share with you is that we went on a wine and tapas tour. We had a tapas and wine tour. And so the guy who we ended up meeting, he was basically telling us about the location where we were at. He was telling us about what we were going to experience. Because in Spain, when a restaurant is a place is 100 years old, what ended up happening is that they get like this placard on the outside, and it tells when it was created, and well, it has to be 100 years old, and it has to be in the same business. And it tells you the year that it was created, and then, and again, the business itself. And imagine going to places that, one of them was 15th century, one of them was 16th century, and one of them was 18th century facility. And so here's the guy, and I want you to sort of listen. So this piece, and I recorded this actually for this talk when I realized that I was going to switch it up a little bit. All right, just one sec. It's short. I don't know, hope the volume comes through.
Writers, playwriters, poets, artists, they all live here at this part of the trip. And at that time, it was kind of the border between the city, the end right there, a couple of blocks away. Nowadays, that is grown a lot since then. So this is now considered to be part of the historical city center. And also one of the most I always like to introduce the tourists with a saying that I like. And in English, we would say that in taverns, as you like, you can be good at more than 2 or 3 things. Right? So that's where you're going to do today. It's proposed 4 different places. We're going to try and taste those 2 or 3 things at. Yeah? So important before we start, any regarding food, any allergies, anything you don't eat, anything I should know?
I don't eat pork.
You eat pork?
No.
Welcome to Spain.
I know.
I don't like pork in Spain.
All right, no problem.
Okay, so you sort of see this, right? So you get this piece where I'm like, okay, I don't do this, and he's like, wait now, welcome to Spain. You understand that he basically really helped. I mean, here I am, I do have this piece. He adjusted it, he had told us the story, or the light story, what was sort of going on. And for the wine and tapas tour that he took us in, he made sure that the restaurants that we went to, right, was ones that could, cater to my diet, or I could eat things on the menu. The reason I want to share that story is because you meet the tourists where they are. Everyone else was fine with their, diets. But you meet people where they are, and you don't know where they are. And they're going to bring themselves to the narrative, right? So however they interpret a story, they're going to interpret it to the narrative, all right? And so the second piece, this was one that I really enjoyed. This was right outside of a young lady was telling us about the history of Madrid. And she was trying to give us this, again, very short pieces, but then she did something that's here that's related to this story, and I was talking about the racial currency piece. So let's see how this one goes.
To the 8th century. Then in the 700s, we are going to have the Moors coming into Spain, right through the south of Spain. They are going to conquer the whole country. They are going to get to the north of Spain, to the Pyrenees, and then from there, the Christians will start this reconquista, reconquest, right? Taking the territories back, which is going to take 800 years, okay? That's why also today in Spain, I already mentioned that we are a very multicultural country, right? Especially related to the Arabs, right? I mean, they were here for 800 years. You look at our skin, you look at our faces, and you can see that we are not only North European people, but we are here too, and also Middle East and North Africa people, right? I mean, so everything. The Spanish language has a huge influence from the Arabic language, the food, the music, all the folklore, all the traditions, okay? So they were here for almost 800 years, and the big capital was where?
But the big capital was Cordova, because we have that, yes.
Córdoba, okay.
And he gets a start.
Córdoba, big cities for the Moors too, also Sevilla, Málaga,
Yes,
Granada,
yes.
Toledo, okay? All of them in the south of Spain, okay? The big capital of Al-Andalus was in there. Spain is flat, okay? It has a very big plateau, then of the coast, and we have the mountains that you can see in there, those mountains. In front of us, also on the left-hand side, those are hundreds of kilometers long. They are separating the country into the north and the south of Spain, okay? From the
Okay, so here you saw her giving a more traditional history lesson, right? But again, where she was setting it up was basically she had said, okay, here, because we had already asked previous questions about like, what was the population, what was the groups of people that were there, who was it, what was the major influences? And so she basically took that and she now wrapped up the story and put that into the history lesson. Now this goes back to, so that detour to Spain goes a little bit back into where I want to go to here in a second in our presentation. So in essence, what happens is that the tour guides were there, not only there, but I also, again, I work in the tourist industry. I work with this guy. I don't know if some of you have worked with him in the past. His name was Linwood Simone. I used to work for the Pennsylvania Humanities Council. I also lived in Learned Scholar. I had the areas of Harrisburg, Chambersburg, and Carlisle. And so what happens is that you're basically setting more and more interest in an area. Now, I'm going to share a little bit more about growing up in Mississippi in the 1970s and 80s, and then I'm going to talk about that story of Juneteenth, and then how the stories of the black jockeys counteract the stories of the Confederate monuments. And so, in essence, what we're sort of looking at is that just like the stories in Spain, you have these conflicting narratives, right? These narratives that's always there when you have this conflicting narratives and the like sort. The same is going to be true when we sort of look at something like a Juneteenth, right? So I grew up with these. These are nice, we call them Confederate memorials. Right now in popular language on television, they call them monuments. You understand the difference between a monument and a memorial, right? You understand the difference between a monument and a memorial. So then therefore, if you're down south and someone is telling you, they're having a conversation with you, they're going to refer to these are Confederate memorials. That means you have a reverence for them. That means that these are sacred. This is worthy of being revered. It's not just a statue, right? And so the very language that you use becomes very important. Because so for the most part, right, you knew that, so we would go to places, so I'm from the South, you're not gonna go many places in the South. You go to a courtroom, you go to a courthouse, you go to a place where you go and get, when I got my driver's license, when I went to go and register, when I got registered for a marriage license, I had to go past a Confederate statue, a Confederate memorial. That was letting me know, that very statue there let me know what was in charge. It told the story within itself. Someone never had to say a word. Just like that old cathedral there with its bell towers. You don't have to sort of never climb up to know the bells are there. It tells a narrative and a story. Here, I went to the University of Mississippi. It's affectionately known as Ole Miss. This was in the center of the this is in the center of what we call Lyceum. This statue did not come down to 2020. So every time I went to class,
Is that Silent Sam?
it's not Silent Sam, this is the one we had on our campus. Silent Sam is the one at the University of North Carolina,
Okay.
right? And all of them sort of have it. So that lets me know that that space, let me just say what that means. Just like the space of me going to the courthouse, that sent the message. That's the way the narrator, whoever's narrating that story, they're contextualizing that for me. If a person doesn't know it, they're contextualizing. But also it tells us something about space. So initially, the University of Mississippi, it was said during the days of desegregation, if you integrate with the University of Mississippi, every other school in the South would fall, and that's what actually happened in 1962, when James Meredith integrated the University of Mississippi. Every school in the South fell. Okay, meaning that all of them integrated. And so what happens is, we did not take the statue down though until 2020. And so as I was going to class and coming from class, I had to pass by a Confederate statue. That's letting me know that that space was not initially created for me. So then now, how do you create a narrative in areas that were not necessarily, that was designated to show you that it was not created for you? I come from a beautiful hometown. Everybody, when they think of Mississippi, they think in the heat of the night. They think about the Mississippi Delta. They think about everything they talk, they think about these, catfish, cotton, and the like sort. But I grew up along the Mississippi Gulf Coast. It's nothing but, water. I grew up with fish. I smelled fish and the like sort. I grew up 80 miles east of New Orleans. We were more influenced by New Orleans culture and the Napoleonic law and the idea of parishes versus counties more than we were, the rest of Mississippi. Now, I say all this because my home area is the most progressive in Mississippi. It's the largest town, the largest town in Mississippi is the capital, it's 275,000 people. The second town is my hometown, which is 72,000. It is the most progressive area. The most progressive areas still have a Confederate monument, okay? Now, with that Confederate monument there, as you can sort of see it, unless we forget, we fear that we forget. So again, anytime you go in there, anytime you passing it up, leaving the courthouse or going to the courthouse, you're gonna see this Confederate statue. In 2020, what happened was this understanding, this was again after George Floyd, and what happens is that they actually went up for the vote in the most progressive part of Mississippi. They said, okay, should we keep our Confederate statue? It went for a vote. There was 5 people on the council. Somebody got sick. The paper said it wasn't COVID related. But because it was a tie, the statue still stands. Now, the part of this statue, just like most southern statues, when you go around these areas, they were built by a group called the United Daughters of the Confederacy. The United Daughters of the Confederacy, long before women had the right to vote, they were, again, primarily responsible for most of the southern statues that you see. And I'll tell you another feat that they pulled off in just one few seconds. What happens is they paid $1,500. They got the other folks to chip in $1,000. This statue been up ever since 1911. The United Daughters of the Confederacy started in 1894. They continue to this day. They operate out of Richmond, Virginia. Their aim is to praise and preserve Confederate history. As you can see here, this is what they're doing. Here in this particular image, what you find is these are school children, and they made a nice little Confederate flag there, and this was at the dedication, and this was in 1907. This was 600 school children. They formed a Confederate flag. And what they were trying to do was they were unveiling the statues of J.E.B. Stewart and Jefferson Davis, their monuments. The United Daughters of the Confederacy are also active while the rest of America have Mount Rushmore with its president. They responded to Mount Rushmore by giving us Stone Mountain in Georgia, right? And so Georgia, and our Stone Mountain in Georgia, on this particular piece, it has the Robert E. Lee, the Stonewall Jackson, and Jefferson Davis. Now, every time that they would go to work on any building statues or straightening up the Stone Mountain, it always happened at the height of civil rights activities. So when you see, when there's a spike in civil rights activities, you see memorials going up. I want you to keep that in mind for a second. If you see any type of civil rights activities going on, these statues will go up. Now, one of the things that the United Daughters of the Confederacy put out there was that they had certain tenets. They said that, hey, look, the Civil War was not about slavery, that enslaved people were happy. In fact, you have most people right now in America believing that Mammy existed, the image of Mammy existed during slavery when it did not. Historical record will show you that Mammy is a post-slavery creation. But in the minds of popular culture, when they look at Gone with the Wind or Birth of a Nation or something like that, but these are, famous movies, what happens is that they look at the flower, the figurines and the like sort, they think that Mammy was something that was there during slavery, and she was not. But the Daughters of the United Daughters of the Confederacy helped to spread that image. What happens is they minimize the roles that Black people would play in American history. This is crucial to remember. They also basically, created a headspace, right, in a physical space for what and who mattered in history. And they were so influential, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, that they were able to get a memorial at Arlington Cemetery that was dedicated to the Confederacy. Now, why is this important? Because Arlington Cemetery is a cemetery that's devoted to people who gave their lives for fighting to preserve the United States. Now, not only did the United Daughters get a memorial in the Arlington Cemetery where they have Mammy, hating to see her white folks go away. And then also they have a Black soldier that's there. Now, a Black man is following a white man. But what happens is they were able to get a statue of the Confederates before the United States colored troops will be recognized, which is not going to happen until after the Civil Rights Movement. Now, they have a catechism that is still practiced today. They still give awards away in scholarships if you go to their websites. If you look at children, again, it's on their websites if you want to see it yourself. If you go to their website, United Daughters of the Confederacy, if you look under, it's called Children of the Confederacy. These are some of the catechisms that they actually have. They'll ask you, was the war about slavery? They'll tell you it was there because they wanted to hold their property and the like sort. Now that's going to be very important because I'm going to tell you something in a few seconds. Here are some of the catechisms for children, for example. How were slaves treated? They were treated with good care. A cruel master was wrath and lost the respect of his neighbors if he treated his slaves badly. What was the feeling of the slaves towards their masters? They were faithful and devoted, and always ready and willing to serve them. And how they behaved during the war. They nobly protected and cared for the wives of soldiers in the field and widows without protectors. Right? They were always true and loyal. Now, these catechisms are continuing to be taught today, and this is why this is important. In a second, I'll show you. They also have a measuring rod for textbooks. So therefore, in American history, the reason that you never hear the Confederates being really considered to be traitors, or you never hear about a story that, that basically villainizes the South, because basically in the 1920s, they made it illegal to do so and to reject such textbooks that did so, right? And so that was their measuring rod. And they got rid of, certain books that had that type of philosophy. Now, today we're talking about something like, they call it critical race theory, which is really just the truth telling of American history. But the United Daughters of the Confederacy Again, they created a mythology, and that's the mythology that's taught as American history. And I say that because my first narrative, and I want you to listen to this, and this has become very crucial about the role, the gospel of the tour guide. My first narrative in school, I learned, and it was not until I came up here as a grown person who had graduated from an historically black college and earned a PhD. I got up here to Pennsylvania, and lo and behold, I realized that y'all celebrated the Underground Railroad. That was strange to me. Absolutely strange. Because it did not correlate with the history books. See, the history books and put me to the test, between 1850 and 1860, the American history book basically tells you that the South had every legal right, we're not talking about more right morals, every legal right to own own their slaves. The Compromise of 1850. Then we have the, popular sovereignty, when you look at Kansas, Nebraska. We learn why the Republican Party gets started. We learn about the debates. But for the debate, we learn about John Brown, right? So for the most part, the law was on the South. The law was on the side of the South. So how did I learn the Underground Railroad? It was a criminal enterprise that denied people their personal property.
Wow.
Now, that's the narrative, and it is backed up by American history textbook. That's why the person who actually helps to shape that narrative, interpret and give nuance to that narrative, becomes very essential and vital. So when I got up here and I learned, well, you celebrate the Underground Railroad, but you're taking people's property. And I'll tell you how the teacher told us. It's like somebody coming in and taking your bike. Now, would you like it if somebody came and take your bike and went on with you? And of course, as children, we said, no. That took care of that. Okay? And so that was it. And so that's how we understood it. And so when you're now looking at a group like the United Daughters of the Confederacy, a group that's really invisible, but in many ways what they did was they served as a powerful tour guide group, because they put monuments in every space and gave a narrative. So the place that when people would go to the central part of town, or wherever they would go, they would see these visual reminders of what narrative and who had the narrative in the South. Pretty much like me going to Salamanca, Cordova, Toledo, Madrid. I'm learning about the spaces and who's telling the story and who's interpreting the story. Now, the facts of that real story is that there were, of course, 4 million people that were enslaved in America, and that American slavery was the second largest enslaved population in the world, only second to Russian serfdom. And that American slavery in 1860 was worth $3.5 billion, and today it's $110 billion. Why does that matter? Because even when the North talks about the South, somehow they don't put it in their own economic system. So see how the United Daughters of the Confederacy, the South may have lost the war militarily, but they won it socially. They told a narrative that has people like Dylan Roof. If you read his manifesto, he's going to quote American history, and he's going to talk about the narrative that the United Daughters of the Confederacy told, right? Not the narrative of the American nuanced story. That's what allowed him to go in to a church, pray with people, and eventually kill them. It's going to have young people believe that they're losing something, and they're going to take teaching tours. They never even met Robert E. Lee. His family didn't even want the statue up, but yet still they're going to have such a hold on the mindset and the shaping of the narrative that the statue has, that it's going to have one young man to get in his car, crank it up, put his foot on the pedal, and run it over and kill a woman. That's the power of the narrative. So, Juneteenth, this is the power of the narrative. I grew up in the 1970s and 80s, again, I was postal rights movement. So let me just tell you what happened. Juneteenth, I didn't know that the world didn't celebrate Juneteenth. All my life, I've always celebrated Juneteenth. Juneteenth was everything. You know what happens is you get out of school in May, right? Then you go to Juneteenth, and then all vacation Bible school starts. That's the summer, right? And so what ended up happening was that Juneteenth would kick off everything. Right? So now everybody, so it was not unusual to have rodeos because people have horses and people have horses and so what happens is that, so one of the first Juneteenths that I just remember being in awe was that when I learned we had, at Juneteenth, we always sing the National Negro Anthem, which is lift every voice and sing, right? So then, again, the counter narrative. Yes, we knew how to sing, Star Spangled Banner, but we also knew lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring with the harmonies of liberty. One. We also learned that, see, they're not going to tell you this in the history books. So, here's one. Never forget this one. They were remaking this guy, they were telling his story. He hadn't died. They said, oh, he hadn't died that long ago. His name was Winfield. They told us this, and I'll tell you exactly how they used to tell us at Juneteenth. They normally have it at a stadium, normally have it at a big field. What you see is all these placards up of Black history and Black this and Black people. Black people gave the world at Juneteenth. And so what happens is they had this picture up, and they were telling us out of all things that Black people were the ones that did the Kentucky Derby. See, what happens is down south, white women really don't wear a lot of fancy hats besides their derby. Now, Black women, they always wear hats going to church, right? So when the white women put on the hats, that's when they went to the derby. And so then when you learn them, and you learn like, what? You mean to tell me that, and they tell you that at the Kentucky Derby, Black jockeys were the ones that actually started it and ran it. What? You mean to tell me that Black people were the first people who ran the Kentucky Derby? Yes. Did you know that? And the reason that they didn't want to compete with us no more was because they were scared because we kept beating them and we were going to prove white supremacy wrong. That's how Juneteenth was. That's how beautiful it was. It had to give us a counter narrative to the narrative of, right? The only variable was in the legal system that denied people their property. So Juneteenth was the counter narrative. And it was filled with historical facts that was not yet in the history books. Just like the ones that, the Gibbons family. They had to keep saying, well, he's some kin to the Jeffersons. No, y'all not. Yes, we are. Yes, we are. No, you don't. Then DNA would come about. Well, we know some of the Jeffersons we kin to. But it was in the preservation, in the historical narrative, in the oral tradition. And so in the oral tradition, imagine being a kid and you're learning that the Kentucky Derby, one of the big horse races, was Black at one time. When you're looking at the images, everywhere else is white. The counter narrative. And these people at Juneteenth, they were our guides. They were our new gospel. So when we sat in the classroom, we knew there was a nuance. Even though it wasn't there, we knew it was a nuance. And there's that preservation that has to be recognized. It has to be reconciled. Today, when you look at this building, People's Hall, this is a special building for me. Before I got to PA, I was a First Douglas scholar. First Douglas gave his last public address, one of his last public addresses at Westchester University. And so what happens is he did it on lynching. And so what happens is that my dissertation was on lynching. And so, you know, I was reading his work because he actually wrote some essays on lynching. And so when you're not from PA, when they tell you that Frederick Douglass in his writings, he was saying he went to this meeting house and this meeting house and this meeting house. That's just like saying he went to A, B, C, D. You don't know the area, so what is it? One meeting house is all meeting houses, right? So when I got up here, and I ended up going, you know, settling into the town that I settled into, and then I paid them a Quaker, so, you know, I'm going in and I'm going to see, you know, some of the pieces, and to do a presentation for one meeting house, I was doing some preparatory work, and I realized that Frederick Douglass had stepped foot in my meeting house. But I didn't realize that, because again, when you're reading it 10 years ago and you didn't know the area, you didn't know the location, you didn't know what it meant, you didn't know what it means. And so this particular building was actually started because people at a fight broke out at a Quaker meeting house. No, it isn't such a literal fight broke out, and they were scared that it was gonna burn like the one down in Pennsylvania Hall in Pennsylvania, in Philly. So this meeting house is a direct result of what happened here in Philadelphia, okay? And so they end up, the motto of this meeting house is let truth and error grapple, okay? And it was started in 1845. It's still in existence in today. We're still fundraising for today. And that's what it basically, you know, says here. But I want to tell you the significance of this piece as it relates to how Black people see this building. First of all, they don't call it People's Hall. They call it Freedom Hall, one. And a person who was a descendant of the slave, she said, and this old building still stands as a tribute to the voices now still. It stands as a monument to old friends who dared to do right. So that narrative is now, as we tell the story of People's Hall, that narrative and the narrative of those Blacks, those enslaved people who basically led to that grappling, right, is there. Here's that legacy of Douglass delivering that last speech. This is me and some of my students and some colleagues. Because Frederick Douglass gave his last public address there, the topic of this presentation was preservation. What we wanted to do was to make sure that we preserve for the students who were coming, right? That they understood that. Remember I told you when I went to the University of Mississippi, that space was not meant for me. Because it had Confederate, I lived off a Confederate road. Okay. And so the first building that I had my first academic office in was J.K. Barnum Hall. J.K. Barnum was a governor and a senator. He said if it's necessary to lynch every end in Mississippi to maintain white supremacy, we will do so. That space was not meant for me. So then what happens is we took this, what Frederick Douglass giving his last public address, one of his last public addresses, and we made a beautiful statue. We preserved that monument. And we have this student, now students going round and around with freedom calls they have, right? So that campus now belongs to them. They have a space and a place on the campus. That leads up to the end of this talk here, is that I think it's very fitting what's happening in Philadelphia, the new police station, where you have Lucretia Mott and you have Francis Ellen Watkins Harper. And what you have is that, you know, when people like to tell the story of, you know, Quakers and Pennsylvania, and especially in the areas like Philadelphia, you know, I always ask the question, well, who was the first abolitionist? And people like to say, oh, William Garrett, you know, they go on and, you know, William Lloyd Garrison, they give all these names. And I said, no. He was the first enslaved person who put one foot in front of the other. Because basically, Quakers had a testimony and a witness. It had to be put to the test. And that test came from the folks who put one foot in front of the other. in Salt Springs. That test would actually go to the 1866 over there in Germantown. We know that first, anti-slavery statement. It would lead to a split within the Quaker community that would not be joined back into the 20th century. And so how can you ever, when you tell one of the greatest testimonies about the Quakers and their peace, you have to tell the story. You tell the story of abolitionists, but you have to also mention those enslaved people who put one foot in front of the other. You can give the proper nouns, Francis Ellen Wallace Harper, Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, William Steele. You can talk about them, yes, but also those many folks whose names we don't know, right? You can talk about. So with that piece, is like when you're now talking about a narrative and sharing a narrative, right? I think this emblem here, this shield that's now in the police station, really works because it tells a nuanced story. Lucretia Mott and her, free produce movement and her refusal to help Frederick Douglass get his, supplies, because I don't buy anyone, and the burning down, and they trying to not burn her house down, is still steeped. The anti-slavery movement, part of the piece about the women's rights movement, is still steeped. Her story in Count William Penn is still steeped. And now what people put one foot in front of another and basically presented themselves when they weren't supposed to present themselves because they were supposed to be chattel property. They were not supposed to have a voice, but they did. And in having a voice, they basically forced just like they forced Quakers to go from one side to the other. They forced this nation to decide if it was going to remain half free and half slave. Period. So the story of abolition is not one of white saviorism. It's one about how these people made the nation reconcile what didn't happen in Philadelphia at the Constitutional Convention. And you can't keep them out of the narrative. How do you talk about George Washington? You can't. It's great stories. I love what they did with the American Revolution. And I really like the story of Tonya Judge and how she puts him to the test. And so at that moment, right, just knowing at the very end of this, what I want you to sort of know is that the gospel comes from you. It helps to shape the narrative, just like the United Daughters of the Confederacy, that we're still trying to deal with today in reconciling today. How you tell and shape a story, how you shape a narrative is somebody's gospel. Because they come to my classroom and they tell me, this is what I heard. My tour guide told me this. My docent told me this. It's the one that makes them go and look something up. It's the one that shapes the narrative. And you're a part of that story. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. Any questions? Yes.
What about the Gators? All right, you didn't have no problem with Gators down in Mississippi?
No, guess what? We don't have them as much as Florida. As much as Florida has. Florida, Louisiana swamps have. You talking about that?
Yeah, the Gators.
Yeah. No, we don't have them as much as Florida and Louisiana.
And you never said anything about the first African American. It's like Carter G. Woodson. The Carter G. Woodson is everything you've just been talking about.
Okay, so let me tell you what Carter G. Woodson said is very interesting. So for those of you who do not know, Carter G. Woodson is the person who did several things. And here's that nuance about how American history is shaped. Carter G. Woodson was the first person, so he would create, he has a book, it's called The Miseducation of the Negro, which is actually read at most historically black colleges. It's like a foundation. He has it's a very famous line out here. He says, if you control a man's mind, you don't have to worry about his actions. If there is no back door, he will yield one. And it's talking about the mindset of having really whites control minds, black minds. And so Carter G. Woodson would start and we know that Negro History Week. Negro History Week would grow into Negro History Month. Now here's this piece here. Students are always, black students and black people and people across America, they'll say this. They gave us the shortest month of the year. You know who they are, right? You know, everyone know who they are, right? You know they. You're like, oh. And I'm like, no, that's not true. No. Carter G. Woodson, an African-American male, chose February for 2 reasons. Abraham Lincoln's birthday, and the month that Frederick Douglass chose for his birthday. That's how we get February. And I said, even that song I just told you about, and Carter G. Woodson was really not original in choosing that date because of that song that I told you, the National Negro Anthem. It actually was created by 2 brothers, right? Bosman and Douglas.
James Weldon.
James Weldon Johnson. And so the Johnson brothers. And what happens is, he wrote the poem, and then his brother put it to music. And it was first performed in Jacksonville, Florida, in honor of Lincoln's birthday. And that was done in 1901. Or 1901, I was in 1901, 1904, something like that. And so what happens is, he took that February, again, from something that James Weldon Johnson had already created, because they were already having many programs, right, celebrating Lincoln's birthday, and that's how we end up getting February. And so, in essence, what that piece with Carter G. Woodson said, he basically spells it out, is that you're not going to look at any element of American history, even from its origins. Like, even when we talk about the American history, when I used to grow up, there was a series of Sunday morning cartoons, and they had this thing called Schoolhouse Rock. Schoolhouse Rock gave most people my generation their history. And it always starts, No More Kings is one of my favorites. The No More Kings always start in Plymouth. But we know that American history, it started in Jamestown. But it's so hard to tell people not to go to Plymouth as opposed to Jamestown. Because if you recognize Jamestown, you now have to recognize slavery. And that's the antithesis of what that's supposed to be the origins. And so anytime you now, that's why this 1619 project is making people tremble. Because what it's doing is actually saying no. But look at the record. Look at the record. Look at the record.
Well, he also did the first African-American Encyclopedia set of the United States.
Mm-hmm.
I have all of it. For $2.50. I got every single volume.
Oh, wow.
They were just throwing it away in the trash.
Wow.
Anyone else? Anyone? Yes.
Is it in Gulfport, the Jefferson Davis House?
Yes, we have, it was actually in Biloxi. We call it JD. Everything that we have the junior college is JD. A lot of places that we have, a lot of the high schools and everything else, but it's actually, Bullwall is his retirement home, and that's where he spent his retirement. It's in Biloxi, and Gulfport and Biloxi are twin cities.
So what's going on with that?
Oh, it's
It's
still
still a
standing.
big tourism site?
Oh, yes, it's never gonna go away.
And can you tell me what went on in Indianapolis with the Children's Museum and the Juneteenth? I missed something there.
Oh, I'm not familiar with that, I can't tell
There
you.
was a hubbub about, they were gonna have a celebration at the Children's Museum.
Oh, she's talking about the watermelon
Yes,
dish that they.
but I don't know what that was
It was
about.
considered, how can I say it, they considered it a mistake by associating watermelon all the time with the African Americans in the South. So that watermelon salad was considered slanderous at that particular spot. So that was the end of that story right there.
And we're gonna have to, let's just say something here, we're gonna have to make some reconciliation. I mean, when I say this, I'm gonna go on record for saying this. Right now, we're at the very beginning of this. Remember how Walmart just made a little hubbub, and they basically went to they great value. You know, now that Juneteenth is a holiday that's recognized, we live in a capitalist society. Of course you're gonna have Juneteenth sales. Right now they got Juneteenth watches, they got Juneteenth clothing. Walmart thought that they could have a great value, Juneteenth ice cream. It failed miserably. Y'all know they pulled it, right? But what happens is, we're gonna have to go through this period. But it's certain things that we're gonna have to also come to understand. So there is one history with chicken and watermelon. But then it's also a celebratory history with chicken and watermelon. Right now, what we're going to is that ownership of the story. We have one group who's saying, we want to own what story is told about chicken and watermelon. Not the ones who basically told the story initially that made it one that was one of buffoonery. And so you understand that this right now, this piece about should they have watermelon here, should they have chicken, should it be a monkey here, should it be this and that. You understand that we're gonna go through that for about the next 20 to 30 years as we reconcile who controls that narrative. And that's why the telling of the stories becomes so crucial. The language that's used, memorial versus monument. How you if you're gonna put a placard somewhere to give the context of something, right? You have people like me, I'm not necessarily one that, supports a woman who robbed people of their labor, who was known, if you read any biography about her, she was known for never keeping money in her hands, being very generous, being very socialist down to politics of Harriet Tubman. But you have a group of people now who actually ran away from slavery, because, she had a deep memory of her sisters being sold from her, and she was concerned herself about the status of, the plantation that she was on and its economics. But now we want to put somebody on a $20 bill. You understand that we're going to have to do some reconciling of history. Because on one hand, the narrative of Harriet Tubman does not match what the demands of representation that's wanted now from a certain demographic. You understand that?
Well, Canada did correct that, because on the $10 bill is an African woman named Viola DeMone. But what I really wanted to ask you about was to explain them a Doom Day in Philadelphia.
A Doom Day has a very complex history now, because it's now going to, some people believe that it's going towards a more commercial stance, because initially they used to have like a whole cleansing process, going through the city, sharing the history. It was almost like a spiritual, and cultural celebration that's akin to what I know to be like a Juneteenth, vendors, white people coming out, sharing narratives. Whereas, now it's sort of turned to something else. But it initially started off, I think, pretty much like in the history of, African festivals, some people who are coming from various, you have them throughout the Caribbean and early Americans, how basically people would have these, like creolized, celebrations of wherever they were, celebrating, some of the festivities and activities that they had. And a Doom Day started off, and again, initially is that, but again, it's going through its, piece, but it started off a lot, from what I understand about it, it's pretty much like, that 1970s and 80s, Juneteenth that I was very familiar with, again, talking about this celebration of African and African-American culture. But just like, other aspects, is things, people as different people come in and missions change and the like sort, but the central root is that it's this acknowledgement that, Black Lives Matter.
Well, the way I got it was the celebration of the Africans, the Ganges, that was set free from slavery when slavery was over, given their freedom by the judge that lived in the Belmont Plateau. And they settled in like the Rittenhouse, South Philly area. And that's, which is now totally gentrified, okay? And that's where they settled, going way back to the 1790s, going into the 1800s, is where Africans had settled after they were set free. It was a story like Amistad, where they came here to Philadelphia in slavery, and I can't remember the judge of Belmont Plateau,
Peters.
Judge Peters set them free in a court case, and they settled in the Rittenhouse, South Street area, all up in that area.
And so, you know what, now, there is and you can, like just like the Juneteenth, how did Juneteenth, the Texas celebration, find itself in Mississippi? How did it find itself in Louisiana? How did it find itself in various ways in Alabama, the Georgia, in the Carolinas? What happens in the Seattle? Because people migrate, and as they do that, stories blend, come together, and they quilt a story in a narrative. That I want to focus on something more of what you said. And this is where I think that here's that telling the stories. And this is that big, shift. I never learned that Black people were set free. But I hear that a lot here in the Northeast. I hear that, Black people struggled and earned their freedom. That's a different piece than set free. And that's the language component that I think that as you talk about narratives, the word choice becomes important. Because one that set free is a passive citizenship. It's always open to interpretation to the people who set them free. Whereas earned and struggled is pretty much in the history of like the patriots of this nation. That therefore, their citizenship can be determined in their own hands. And so even that language, I even hear, free Blacks. I mean, you never say free whites. I mean, what happens is that, it's just the language becomes important. Because you can make someone passive and active based on the words that you use. And that's what I mean by language.
You teach the younger generation, and I've been told more than once that for the younger generation, history began at breakfast this morning.
Yes.
So we know about Rosa Parks, we know about Dr. King. Very few people, I think, know about Octavius Cato until the statue came up. Almost no one knows that one of the first boycotts was by Richard Allen and Absalom Jones.
Yes.
And nobody talks about that. And I think it's so important, and I'm a native Philadelphian, so I've got a little bit of hometown pride here, but I think it's so important to go back to the late 1700s, and there are Blacks boycotting, and as you're saying, through their perseverance, they eventually earn their freedom. So how do you get this younger generation, feasting on Cheerios, to think about a couple hundred years earlier and the achievements and the efforts that were made on their future behalf?
Here it is. I do it in themes. So you teach resistance. Okay, so here's a resistance, right? And so if I want to talk about shaping of an area, then I'll talk about the yellow fever epidemic, right? So it's according to the themes, because so when you address a theme, you can take that and go through 17th, 18th, 19th, and 20th century, right? So you can connect, let's say, someone like Richard Allen to, I'm trying to think about somebody who's like, let's say, a Richard Allen to, because y'all are native Philadelphians, and I know some of these people have some very, up in the air reputations. So I'm trying to think somebody to say, let's say,
Cecil B. Mill.
Okay, Cecil B. Moore, right. Okay, so what happens is that you can connect those two, but you connect them through a theme and you show them, okay, throughout, there's been a constant struggle on this particular piece throughout, right? So if you're, talking about, so then you can invoke someone like a Paul Robeson who, spent some time. So now you can talk about those areas and bring in people that you know. So, but if you try to go through biography now, they're exhausted. Suits will tell you, I'm so tired of learning about Rosa Parks. They told me that. I don't want to hear about Harriet Tubman anymore, right? And so what happens is literally, I had one student tell me, I was talking to a group of students in Upper Darby at a school called Beverly Hills Middle School. And I asked some students in Downtown, PA, I said, how do you think I should approach this? Whatever you do, please don't talk about Harriet Tubman. Then they told me, we're tired of Harriet Tubman. Because basically she's been overwhelmed because they didn't have a variety of people to talk about. I know it's about that time, the overtime. And so, did anyone have any more other questions? Anyone else?
100.
All right.